we need to talk about authoritarianism. So this is one of the most widely discussed topics when it comes to socialism. It's a word that people use somewhat flippantly, myself included, that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. If I were to define this term, as in the way that I use it when discussing political systems, I would say it involves a system where power is concentrated in the hands of an individual or a small group of individuals who have absolute power and severely restrict civil liberties such as freedom of speech, assembly, democracy, etc. That's how I would use the term in this context. It's when the citizenry do not have a say in the functions of their government. And I think it's hard to deny that many of these socialist regimes do just that. Now, many leftists will argue that, like, hey, Western liberal democracies have their own form of suppression of civil liberties. And I say, fine, that's true, but that doesn't make it a good thing in either case. And we should all be open to critiquing both. You could say that liberals, conservatives, Westoids, whatever, are too harsh on these attempts at socialism, and that is true, but I think an argument could be made that people who criticize the West or whatever for its issues are sometimes too lenient on the issues of these attempts at socialism. And then many leftists will also say that it's actually a good thing that these countries restrict civil liberties the way they do, because it's the best and most optimal way to achieve socialism. And I take issue with that argument as well. I don't think these collectivist ideas are so fragile that you need to literally suppress any and all thought to the contrary in order to create an economic system where workers aren't exploited or whatever. Now, the perfect argument against this is what we're seeing in, say, the US. Free speech can have negative consequences as well when it comes to stifling progress. But when you take all factors into account, I think being generally more open to civil liberties, democracy, etc., tends to be what I would prefer, what I would think is ultimately better. Let's just get into the video. We'll discuss all this stuff as it comes up, I'm sure. So we need to talk about authoritarianism. Let's do it.
Authoritarianism, the practice of eating only people who have published books.
Okay.
Wait, that's not right. Authoritarianism, truly one of the words of all time. A decadent 7 syllables long and wonderfully vague. If you've ever had a conversation about politics, and if you're watching this channel, I'm sure you have, you've likely heard someone use the term, or maybe you've even used it yourself. It's popular in pretty much every corner of the mainstream political spectrum. Liberals, conservatives, the dreaded centrists, and even some lefty groups like anarchist and libertarian socialists. But what does it mean? And what gives it so much weight in the political discourse? Well, that's what this video is about. We've got a pretty poor understanding of what authority is here in the West, but I bet we can fix that. Let's start with the generally accepted definition. Authoritarianism, favoring or enforcing strict obedience to authority, especially that of the government, at the expense of personal freedom. Okay, this is a pretty bad definition if we're being honest. It mentions the government in—
Whoa, why did the playback speed just change? I was trying to pause it.
There, but doesn't really commit to—
I do not know how to recreate that. Authoritarianism, favoring or enforcing strict obedience to authority, especially that of the government, at the expense of personal freedom. Yeah, I mean, this is so broad. It's not how I use the term when having these types of conversations. I'm happy with the government limiting some personal freedoms, you know what I mean? The government should limit your personal freedom to, murder someone. I think we as a public should be happy to cede our right to murder people to the government. I think this is a law that demands strict obedience. Like, this definition here is so broad, it's basically describing the concept of laws. I like laws. My issue comes down to who decides on those laws. Strict obedience to authority, but who is that authority? How much power does the citizenry have in deciding those laws? I think it's more preferable for this authority to be decided upon by the citizens who live in their country. That's not been the case of a lot of these socialist regimes, right? In a lot of these socialist regimes, the general public has absolutely zero power in deciding those laws. They have virtually no say in how their governments operate. In fact, even if you protest these laws, you can go to prison. Now, some on the left here will argue that no, in fact, they have tons of say over their laws, and if that's the case, then great. I'm wrong. I don't know what I'm talking about. Fine, I will concede. If that is true, I will concede. Others will instead argue that, yes, actually they are restrictive on civil liberties and personal freedoms, but that's just necessary to establish socialism. And again, I just don't buy that either. Anyway.
Being political, just kinda, when you want people to follow the rules. That's not super helpful when we're trying to nail down a heavily used term, and one that deals with some serious topics. Okay, so what if we expand it to include how people generally use the term? Generally speaking, when someone uses the word authoritarian, they are often, but not always, using it as a term to demonize a system that is different from their own, regardless of the facts.
I mean, maybe some will do that. I mean, everyone's going to be biased to some extent. I'm obviously biased to some extent. But, I mean, I gave y'all my definition. Again, it comes down to how much power does the general public have over what the government does. And I would extend that to how much, civil liberties that given political system allows for. Speech, assembly, etc. Hang on, I gotta change some settings here. There we go. So, I don't know. I don't love the way he just characterized that. Again, please don't take me saying I don't like what some of these attempts at socialism are doing as me saying the West is perfect or not authoritarian or whatever, or socialism is always authoritarian as authoritarian. Please understand, I'm not saying any of those things. I'm just saying people should have more control over the say of their government, more autonomy over what they're allowed to say than what a lot of these attempts at socialism allow for. And again, it's a thin line. I don't think I'm a fan of direct democracy at the federal level, let's say with the United States. Having every single citizen vote on every single minute little thing, it's just not really feasible. I'm not saying I have a perfect system lying around in my head. I think it could be better than what we see in a lot of these attempts at socialism. I obviously think it could be better than what we see, in a lot of these Western governments. But again, I don't love the way he characterized, saying that's what people mean when they say authoritarian. Maybe some people, but definitely not everybody. I would like to think, at least when I use that term, that's not what I have in mind, implicitly or explicitly. Anyway.
You're using it as a synonym for totalitarian.
Okay. That's a good point. Okay, I wish I'd brought this up earlier. Yes, totalitarianism. That's probably more what I'm against, okay? I think the distinction between totalitarianism and authoritarianism can be somewhat fluid. I don't want to get too bogged down in semantics. I don't care what word you use, whether it's this. I gave you my definition. I gave you what I think is not a good way to run your society. Call it whatever you want. I don't care. But anyway.
A word you don't really hear much anymore. It's sort of fallen by the wayside in favor of authoritarian. Kind of like using the word commie as a slur has been superseded by tanky in the last few years. Same idea, different era. Both of these words, authoritarian and totalitarian, have been leveled at fascism and communism, often in a direct attempt to conflate the two. This is largely due to the US's
red fash, right? That's something I'm seeing a lot more. There's a lot of leftists. There's Keffels, if you've been following this, she's been really coming out against communists on Twitter and stuff, basically saying communists are fascists, things like that. But it is something I'm seeing more and more, and in my comment section as well. There are a lot of people who consider themselves leftists, consider themselves socialists, who maybe even consider themselves Marxists, who will still come out vehemently against these various, totalitarian, authoritarian, whatever aspects of many of these attempts at socialism. To not be as wishy-washy, I think there is, I've made my point clear that there's a lot about what I'm seeing in these countries that I don't think ultimately are the right choice for, governance. But anyway.
Extreme anti-communism post-World War II, to the point that they'd lump in their former friends, the people without whom the Allies could not have won the war, with what most people believe to be the greatest evil in history. Yeah, okay, yeah, that's all well and good. People use a political term vaguely to demonize their opponents. Big surprise. But we still need some specifics. What exactly makes a state authoritarian?
Again, I think I defined this as best I could. Lack of democracy, and severe restrictions on civil liberties, thought policing, lack of freedom of speech, lack of freedom of assembly, lack of freedom of the press. And again, when I'm saying that I don't like these things, and I'm saying that from what I can tell of a lot of these socialist regimes, what I described, the lack of all those things, is a pretty big issue. That is not me saying the West does it perfectly. That is not me saying the US does it perfectly. You will hear me critique the US, especially, and other Western countries at those failings as well, more than I have ever complained about socialist nations. But in these few moments, like right now, I think, my opinion is those restrictions are not ultimately a good thing. So I'm curious how he's going to define this. Let's see.
Well, if you have a scroll through the comments of just about any political video that talks about socialism, you'll find people ready with their pre-written list of objections, usually bundled under the prime objection, that's authoritarian.
Yeah, I mean, laws are not authoritarian. I like laws. I think laws are important as long as it's the public who are consenting to these laws and have an avenue or means to protest or dissent. I think that's a good thing. If my government is doing something that I don't like, I should be allowed to protest in good faith. Now, the good faith aspect, that's the hard part, because you can see in the US, you get a lot of bad faith dissent from conservatives, especially in the US. So again, that's not me saying free speech is perfect or it's not without its consequences. And I don't know if I've said this already, but I am not of the opinion that socialism is inherently authoritarian or totalitarian. In fact, based on the limited research I've done, they should be significantly less totalitarian. You know what I mean? That power should be more spread out. It just doesn't seem to end up that way when these attempts are tried. Now, again, they'll say this is a transition thing. I swear, the CBC will be like, we swear we're moving toward communism, we promise. And it could be they are. I honestly know. But if they weren't, the public would have absolutely no way to protest or say otherwise. They cannot vote this regime out, as far as I know. So again, I don't think that has anything to do with socialism by any stretch. There are plenty of totalitarian, authoritarian capitalist regimes. And just like there are democratic capitalist regimes, whatever, there can and should be more democratic socialist regimes. I don't know. Anyway.
Things on that list include the existence of large prisons or labor camps, a covert police force, state media, a strongman leader.
I mean, hold on. I gotta rewind this. Hold on.
Objection, that's authoritarian. Things on that list include the existence of large prisons or labor camps.
Oh my god, what the fuck? So if I hold the button, it speeds up?
Things on that list include the existence of large...
Okay, I guess if I hold the YouTube video, when I click on it, it speeds up now. That's good to know. Yeah, I mean, people who object to socialism will often be like, you threw everyone in gulags or whatever the fuck. Yeah, that's such a dumb argument because the United States, our prison population per capita, like this isn't something I need to tell leftists, right? It's absolutely fucking ridiculous. So pointing to that as, like number of prisoners or the existence of a prison industrial complex or whatever as an admonishment for these attempts at socialism doesn't hold a lot of water, right? But it's kind of like, why are you being thrown in prison? In the US, and for the love of God, do not take the following sentence or sentences as me trying to at all justify the United States prison system. But from my perspective, if you're thrown in jail in the US, which our jails are horrific, it's unjustifiable, the conditions they're in, it's bad. I'm not in favor of a punitive approach to prisons. I'm in favor of a more rehabilitative approach to prisons. Need to get all the caveats and asterisks out of the way. But in the U.S., when you're sent to prison, it's because you stole something or punched someone or otherwise attacked someone. You committed fraud sometimes. I don't know. That's why you're thrown in prison in the US. We do it too much. We're too punitive. It's all bad. Don't take this as me saying this is a good thing. But, and again, now we're getting into, I'm starting to talk about things I don't know a lot about. But from my perspective, correct me in the comments, as always where I'm wrong, these attempts at socialism will throw people in jail for those things too, but they will also throw you in jail for dissent, protest, attempting to assemble a meeting to discuss, the negatives about your current government. And again, don't take that as me saying the US doesn't or hasn't had political prisoners in that way as well. I'm saying fuck it, both are bad, okay? If it happens in the West, if it happens in the US, great. That's also bad. I don't think anyone should go to jail for saying, I don't agree with what my government is doing. If that makes me a lib, then so be it. And I will say I lurk in a lot of, communist, subreddits and things like that. And this idea of throwing political dissenters in jail, whether they're memeing about it or not, is a common one, is a popular one, and it's not a sentiment I agree with. Now, their arguments are going to be, but we have to do it, otherwise counter-revolutionary rhetoric, fascist rhetoric will inevitably arise, so we need to throw those people in jail. And again, my argument to that is, I don't know, I think if you educate your audience, if they can think critically, you won't need to do those things. I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling, but let's continue this.
Prisons or labor camps.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. That's the other thing. They'll be like, oh, but they're going to throw you in forced labor camps. Well, we do that in the West. Both are bad. Can I say both are bad?
A covert police force.
Yeah, I mean, again, these are things that I guess happen this happens in the West, but it's not the same as we see in a lot of these socialist regimes. Is that fair to say? It's not a one-to-one comparison, especially with
state media.
His next one, calling NPR state media. I don't know. This is not a good characterization by second thought, in my opinion. NPR does really good work. They have significant amounts of autonomy. Like, this is like Elon Musk rhetoric, dude. This is like Nazi rhetoric with Elon Musk, right? He labeled NPR state media or whatever the fuck, which caused them to leave Twitter. It's a lie when Elon says it, and it's a lie when Second Thought says it, which is a little disappointing for me to say because I really have enjoyed every Second Thought video thus far and have not disagreed with him, I think, on something this hard. But characterizing NPR as state media or insinuating that the US, has a state media apparatus like the way you see in a lot of these socialist regimes, I don't know. Obviously, many of like NPR too, I'm not saying NPR is perfect. NPR, CNN, Fox News, all these people will toe the United States State Department line pretty heavily. And that is an issue in and of itself. But again, I don't really think this is a good comparison to make. And you know what? If it is, then fine. I don't think it's good when the West does it. I don't think it's good when these attempts at socialism do it. How about that? Anyway.
Yeah, a strongman leader, censorship, that sort of thing. And to be fair, all those things do sound scary, and none of them are ideal. I think we can all agree that we'd love to live in a society where prisons didn't need to exist. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we go any further, I want to emphasize that I'm not trying to attack anyone here. The objection to authoritarianism is present in a lot of different camps. People may define it a little differently. For example, a libertarian might call seatbelt laws authoritarian, while a liberal might consider the influence of the church on the government authoritarian. Meanwhile, my anarchist friends are yelling from the back of the room that the very existence of a state is authoritarian and we need to abolish bedtime. Again, teasing, no offense intended. Okay, we all on the same page? Authoritarian.
Kinda. I mean, I still don't think he's described this term or totalitarianism, whatever, in a way that I would use it yet, but we'll see.
Authoritarianism is a red flag for a lot of people, and there are some specific objections we can consider. So, let's consider them. Here's what we're going to do for the rest of the video. First, we'll look at the list of objections as understood by liberals. And I mean that in the broadest sense. Liberals as in subjects of liberal states, not in the conservative versus liberal sense. Then we'll look at those same objections as understood by the left. Again, pretty broadly speaking. Basically everyone from social democrats and beyond.
Okay.
Then finally, we'll consider
it's probably, you know, soc dems beyond. I'm probably in there somewhere. If, you know, there's probably some liberal fleas still on me that will skew the way I think about things. But yeah.
a better way to understand authority and authoritarianism. Sound good?
Sure. What the hell is going on now?
All right, liberal friends. I've got a pretty good idea of the kinds of places you feel are authoritarian. Top of the list, Soviet Union, the big one. Perhaps the target of the most intense smear campaign in history. Then we've got Cuba, China, North Korea, and likely a handful of other projects. But I think it's safe to say that these are the big ones. When you look at any of these projects, it's not...
Semantics aside, I don't want to get caught up in semantics, okay? Based on my definition regarding how much power the citizenry have over their government, and how, you know, how much they have in civil liberties, I think that, you know, it is well within reason to critique some of the way these countries have handled their political system. I will be honest, and if that makes me a liberal, as he seems to be implying, then so be it.
Not difficult to see the one thing they all have in common. They're all socialist. And when you see this, it's not...
I don't know, dog. Like, fine, when Saudi Arabia does it, it's bad too. They're not socialist. I will critique them just as much. And so will most liberals. But based on what I described, they're doing the same thing too, which is why I'm saying it has nothing to do with socialism. The fact that Saudi Arabia is, you know, inhibiting speech, inhibiting political dissent, inhibiting democracy, the same amount, quote unquote, that China is, you know, shows to me this has nothing to do with your economic, you know, organization. It has to do with your government organization.
Not entirely unreasonable to come to the conclusion that authoritarianism is a core feature of socialism.
No, and see, I don't know. Maybe I've moved on past 101, the 101 audience he's talking to here. Maybe I've graduated to 102, but no, it's clearly not a function of socialism to me. That's not what seems to be present. It happens just as easily in non-socialist regimes. But that doesn't mean it's a good thing.
We'll address this a bit more thoroughly in a few minutes, but suffice it to say that in the West, we may have a slightly biased opinion on the matter, through no fault of our own. We've just been subjected to nearly 100 years of Red Scare propaganda at this point. Everything we're taught growing up in the imperial core, especially in the US, points us towards the conclusion that communism is evil and capitalism is righteous. But here's the part where I'm going to have to ask you to be willing to consider some unpleasant truths. And I don't say these things to engage in whataboutism or because I'm anti-American or something. Quite the contrary. I believe that in order for any country to live up to the standards it sets for others, it needs to soberly reflect on the facts. And the facts indicate that everything we're taught about these awful authoritarian socialist countries, we are also guilty of.
Again, maybe this is not the video for me or something, but like, that shit does not matter to me, man. Fine. I concede that we do it too. Now what? Does that make it good? Does that make it bad? Like, we shouldn't do it. China shouldn't do it. The USSR shouldn't have done it. What am I missing here? Someone tell me in the comments what I'm missing here.
And often to a far greater degree. Let me elaborate. One thing that rarely gets the attention it deserves is how we talk about authoritarianism. And I mean that literally, like the very words we use. Take the DPRK.
So you define it, bro. Like, that's the thing. Like, we're 6 minutes in. I gave you my definition. I would like it if he would define, like, he did that kind of fake definition back here, but like define it then from your perspective. What are we talking about here? Maybe he will, or in a roundabout way he will, given the benefit of the doubt. But anyway.
We never hear about the government of North Korea. We hear about the Kim regime. This is common when Westerners talk about non-capitalist governments, or even capitalist ones that aren't vassal states of the US. They have a regime.
Yeah, I mean, that's a word I've used pretty flippantly. I'll say socialist regime, etc.
We and our allies have a government. The way we talk about different systems goes a long way towards coloring our perception of them. People criticize labor camps or secret police or any number of other scary authoritarian words. But here's the thing. We have those too. And if you look at the data, often to a far greater extent than any socialist project in history. We just don't call them by those names.
Like, I just don't see the point there, man. Like, fine, let's both not do it, but they'll be more than happy to say all the bad things that Western countries do, and they will not allow any credence to any criticism over these attempts at socialism. I think it's like, both sides, like, liberals are too overly critical, liberals and conservatives, whatever, are too overly critical on these socialist regimes, and these leftists are too lenient on these socialist regimes. But I'm not going to say they're overly critical on the Western regimes. Plenty to criticize. Maybe I am the true centrist, where I say both are bad. Both are doing bad things that we should move away from. I don't know.
We don't have secret police, we have plainclothes officers, or the intelligence community. We don't have gulags, we have detention centers, which, by the way, house far more inmates than the Soviet Union ever did. And of course, we don't have slave labor, we have penal labor. We put inmates to work manufacturing hand sanitizer during a pandemic or fighting fires because enshrined in the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, slavery is illegal except as punishment for a crime. And a lot of the time, that crime is just being poor. A parking ticket you couldn't pay, getting caught with the same drug a rich person uses, but you don't have the money to buy yourself out of trouble. We don't have a Ministry of War, we have a Department of Defense, despite never once fighting a defensive war. Every military action taken by the United States, from bombing hospitals to drone striking foreign citizens, is given the cover of defense. We don't have state media or propaganda, we just have news.
Again, I don't love this characterization. I get it. There are certain arguments you can make. There are a lot of issues with the way we handle news, like the privatization of news, the way we do it. But saying it's the same thing as state media, propaganda outlets, I'm going to be honest, I don't love this characterization. And again, don't take that as me saying US media is good or perfect, but there is, generally speaking, some amount of diversity of thought. The media can contradict the line of the state in the US. In the Trump administration, there was a lot of good journalism against the Trump administration. They could publish stories independently, admonishing the government in power. You cannot do that in this country. That's not a good thing, in my opinion. Like, to say our press is just as free as China's, like, it just does not feel like a good characterization. Even like non-traditional news media like John Oliver or something, or like Hassan, a Twitch streamer, that, talking negatively about the government, both Democrats and Republicans and whatnot, that could not exist in China, in a lot of these socialist countries. Like, we do have more freedom of the press in the US, in the West, or whatever. It'll obviously toe the line of the State Department and whatnot pretty heavily. Obviously, there are issues to that, but we do have a freer press. Journalists, you don't have to work for CNN or Fox News or whatever. You can be an independent journalist. You can be an independent voice and talk shit about your government. You can say fuck Joe Biden and talk about the bad things that he's doing. You can't do that here. State media is always carefully curated. It will always be positive about the, regime. I did it. I don't know. I don't super agree with this. Correct me where I'm wrong in the comments, but I don't know.
Those news outlets are, of course, all owned by the same corporate interests who funnel millions of dollars a year into government pockets to make sure their profits are secure. And
yeah, that's obviously bad, and I'm not trying to say this isn't bad. Obviously, please don't think I'm saying the way we do it in the US and the West or whatever is good or perfect. Will I say it's roughly better to have a freer press? Yes. But you know, this is more of a problem of what? Capitalism than just completely locking away free press in general.
their anchors dutifully repeat the ruling class's ideological positions.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Yeah, this came out a few years ago, and I mean, it's horrible. Obviously, there's a lot of really bad shit. Like, the fact that, I think this was Sinclair who did this, owns such a huge percentage of our media is extremely powerful, you know, but that is an issue of capitalism and accumulating power to a tiny minority, which is an issue of capitalism, but it seems to be an issue of these attempts at socialism as well. No one should have this much power. Institutions like Sinclair should not exist. But I also don't believe in ceding that much power to a government as well, I guess.
And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Their guys are dictators, ours are presidents.
Again, like, we're just gonna move on. Like, we have to say there's a difference between an elected official and what Xi Jinping is, right? Again, don't take that as me saying what we do here is perfect, but we, like, technically could have had Bernie Sanders over Biden or Trump. Bernie Sanders could have been in the, 3/4 through his second term right now if our population wasn't so fucking stupid. But you can't, equate these things, in my opinion. It's not, I assume he's talking in good faith here, but it's just not a good characterization. I don't know.
Their state has a regime, ours has a government. We are free and happy, they're oppressed and miserable. Our nuclear arsenal is for deterrence. Theirs is a threat to global...
Yeah, I mean, some of this last couple stuff is not something I would say, and I'm sure most of y'all have to understand that by now, but anyway.
Peace, despite the US being the only country on Earth to have ever used nuclear weapons. And we did it twice, on civilians, on purpose. Mm-hmm. We have a democracy, they
Again, I know who he's speaking to. He's speaking to the 101 people. I may be in that 102 level class at this point, to where I'm never gonna say something good about the US, right? I think I've made my position clear that my position is both are bad, but I'm not sure what he's going with at this point. Like, is his position both are bad, or is he gonna say, like, actually what they're doing here is good and based, and what we're doing here, despite them being the same thing that he's portraying here, we're bad but they're good? Did that make any sense? Anyway.
have a dictatorship, despite by all accounts places like Cuba and China having far more representation and opportunity for democratic involvement than places like the US.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I feared was gonna happen. Maybe I'm so just, lib-coded. I'm just such a Westoid. I'm gonna say this controversial statement that I don't think China has more or better democratic participation than the United States. As far as I know, maybe I'm just wrong. I don't know. It seems as though Chinese citizens have significantly less power over their national policies and their leaders than we have in the US. I feel like that's something is he going to come back to it? But that is something we just completely glazed over.
And opportunity for democratic involvement than places like Cuba and China having far more representation and opportunity for democratic involvement than places like the US.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a no from me, dog. Like, Oh boy, we have watched a lot of second thought videos on this channel, and this is the one by far I have disagreed with most. We've watched Hakeem videos. He's talked about how, like, vaguely about how places like China have some amount of democratic participation, but to say they have more democratic participation than the US, I mean, not based on my understanding. I mean, I'm willing to give someone like Second Thought the benefit of the doubt, given how correct he seems to be on a lot of other things, but that is not a standpoint that makes sense to me. And again, if China is more democratic than the US and I am just a brain-dead Westoid, great, okay? That makes me happy I would be happy if that were true, obviously, but I don't think that it is true. And, you know, saying that it is so flippantly like that without seeming to explain it, I don't know. In a video like this, I don't know, it leaves a bad taste in my mouth, just gonna be honest.
So the way we talk about government structures, characteristics, and actions matters. Without even knowing it, we can end up falling prey to some very subtle, very sophisticated propaganda that primes us to hate people we've never met, whose economic and government structures we know nothing about, and with whom we share far more in common than we do with our own leaders.
Yeah, I don't hate anyone. I just want to make that clear.
Okay, fine, but those are just words. Who cares what we call our stuff? All right, let's talk specifics. In a striking 2012 article by Adam Gopnik called The Caging of America, the author notes that, quote, overall, there are now more people under correctional supervision in America, more than 6 million, than were in the Gulag under Stalin at its height. And this is coming from an American writer with a thoroughly liberal worldview.
What about per capita?
It's a poignant comparison because, as we all know, Stalin, gulags, and the Soviet Union are the trifecta of what the average person sees as authoritarianism. The fact that we're doing worse than that, even if you buy the inflated numbers of widely debunked books like the Black Book of Communism, should tell you something. And fun fact, the CIA wrote a report in the 50s that the whole Stalin strongman thing was largely a myth. It was just a very useful myth to the capitalist powers, so why not perpetuate it? But I know what you're thinking. Everybody knows the US has a thing for prisons. That's like one thing we could ease back on a little bit. That doesn't make the country authoritarian. Let's continue then. How about surveillance? It's pretty widely believed that citizens of socialist states are the subject of extreme surveillance.
I mean, aren't they? Like, I don't care if the US does it too. It's bad too. But aren't they in these socialist states? Yes, the Patriot Act is awful. It's horrible. Most Americans don't even want it, and yet it still exists, which shows how shitty our democracy is. It's a good example of that. But he's like, a common argument people make against these socialist nations is that they have surveillance, but it's like, don't they? Don't they? If they do, it's not a good thing. If they don't, great, that makes me happy. But again, I don't know, it just doesn't appear to be the case.
But what if I told you that none of them hold a candle to the US? Don't believe me? Take a look at Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Thanks to this piece of legislation, every single person in the United States is the subject of incredibly intense scrutiny.
Is this not the case in, like, China? They won't, at least in the US, I can post, fuck Joe Biden on Twitter, and I won't be sent to jail. I don't think that's the case in China, right? Again, as always, don't take that as me supporting this in the US. All I'm saying is this characterization, again, doesn't feel quite right. I don't know.
Have a mass surveillance program that allows for the collection of phone conversations, text messages, emails, web searches, and social media messages. Everything you do is being monitored. But wait, it's called the Foreign Surveillance Act, so why are we in the crosshairs? Well, it started out as a way to keep tabs on communications between US citizens and foreign nationals deemed a threat of some kind. But over the last decade or so, the scope of the project has expanded dramatically. What was once strictly a counterterrorism tool, which is already incredibly vague and dangerous, has now morphed into a domestic surveillance apparatus where the NSA provides this data to the CIA and the FBI, which they can use to open investigations into any person in the country without a warrant. But what if we want to give US intelligence agencies the benefit of the doubt? They're just doing their job, right? If you're not a criminal, you have nothing to hide. According to a 2022 report, the FBI and CIA conduct millions of these backdoor searches for no legitimate reason.
Not good.
They've pulled data on family members, journalists, political commentators, even government officials. For what reason? Who knows? They want dirt on a politician they don't like, so they read their Twitter DMs. They saw you in a coffee shop and thought you were cute and asked the barista for your name. That's all they need. Some random intelligence creep can plug in your name, phone number, or email address and have access to years of your personal communications, web activity, address, personal details, all of it. No authoritarian regime in history has ever wielded that kind of surveillance power.
Again, I feel like what he just said is just factually incorrect. I think that, like, China, you can look, they have those capabilities too, and use them to squash any dissent on their social media. I think they can just as easily check your DMs or your search history, things like that. And it's just like, I don't know, man. It's fine. It's bad when we do it, but saying they don't do it feels factually incorrect. And if they're not doing it, great. Then whatever. We got nothing to worry about. But I think there is empirical evidence that suggests otherwise.
Okay, dystopian prison population, largest surveillance apparatus in history, that all sounds pretty bad. But at least we have the freedom to criticize the government, right? The secret police aren't going to come drag us away.
This is what I was talking about, right?
I've got some bad news for you there, too.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. It's happened in the past, for sure, but again, not to this same scale, I guess?
US police are the most vicious and unaccountable in the world by far. There are plenty of videos online of police arresting journalists, brutalizing peaceful protesters, even laughing about killing innocent people. I have a whole video on the subject, actually. But here's the gist of it. According to ongoing reporting, US police kill over 1,000 American citizens per year. 1,000 people, and I can hear the objection already.
Jesus Christ.
Some of those people were probably criminals. Police are not meant to be judge, jury, and executioner.
Not my
They're
argument.
meant to arrest people if they have to, and then hand them over to the judge, jury, and we really should talk about the executioner part. Open social media on any day of the week, and you'll see a story of an officer-involved shooting, where the media tries really hard to twist the reporting to make the cop sound less like a murderer. With body cameras often required these days, it's getting harder for them to hide their crimes, though they still try. Anyway, the bottom line is this. If we look at any other country on Earth, let's say China, the hot-button supposed authoritarian hellhole of the day, and we compare police violence stats, the US is far worse. In the US, in 2022, police killed 1,201 people. In China, that number is 0. Oh, wait, nope, I read that wrong. 0 people killed by police since 2019, a year when 2 people were killed. 2 people in 5 years. In a country with a population 4 times greater than the United States.
That's pretty crazy.
Since 2019,
information coming out of China is very sanitized. I would think even second thought would understand that or admit that.
US police have killed nearly 5,000 American citizens.
That's nutty.
So, we have a more dystopian prison situation, we're the most spied on people on Earth, and our police murder 3 people on average every single day. If that's not authoritarian, I don't know what is.
Yeah, again, he hasn't really touched on my definition, which comes down to how much say you have over your government. And I guess he did when he said that China actually gives their citizenry more say over the function of their government than the US. He said that in approximately 1 second and has not come back to it or preceded that with any sort of analysis, which makes me think, I don't know, man. Something's off. There's some bad faith ignoring or whatever. But yeah, when it comes to lack of democracy, lack of ability to dissent, lack of freedom of speech, lack of freedom of assembly. That's what I think of when it comes to authoritarianism, totalitarianism, whatever. This other stuff, sure, you can call it that, I guess. These are obviously all bad. But so far, the fact that he's diminishing the way countries like China do these things as well, I think is not good. Again, if they don't do it and I'm just completely been brainwashed by liberal propaganda, then great, fuck it. But in my understanding, in my experience, that doesn't appear to be the case.
And this isn't to run defense for the excesses of past and present socialist projects. In fact, socialists are among the loudest and most well-read critics of these experiments. The Deprogram guys and I have a podcast episode specifically dedicated to the topic, and we plan to do more in the future.
We did a recent reaction to a Hakeem video that kind of tackled some of this stuff.
The point of all this is that if we're going to rightly level criticism at some states, we need to make sure to apply that standard universally. And that means starting at home rather than simply passing judgment on countries halfway around the world or that have long since passed.
Yeah, I mean, I can agree with that sentiment, and I think he's mostly speaking to the average liberal, the average conservative, who will say, China's horrible for doing all of these things while ignoring the rough equivalencies that the US does. But I guess in my experience, and again, he just now sort of hand-waved it again, I think some people can be too lenient on, places like China, North Korea, etc. I think it goes both ways. Some people can be too lenient, and then some people can be too harsh or ignoring, as he's putting it, the problems at home. And I am on team criticize both. From liberals, I'm not seeing enough criticism of the West. From a lot on the left, I'm not seeing enough criticism of these socialist countries. Just gonna keep it honest. Anyway.
Okay, that's the liberal part taken care of. Now it's time to have a little chat with my friends on the Western left. The right does a very good job at presenting a unified front. The capitalist class and the forces of reaction are incredibly powerful in the imperial core. The left is already on the back foot, and we have been for many, many years. This is why it's frankly absurd how much infighting goes on among the left.
It's kind of what I was talking about with Keffels right now. She is going off on Twitter as we speak, targeting people like Second Thought, pretty much.
Social Democrats sniping at tankies for being authoritarian doesn't do the movement any good. Funnily enough, the label...
I generally agree with that. Not to say the left shouldn't criticize these attempts at socialism. That's kind of what I've been doing all video. So, I think it is good to criticize a lot of what these attempts at socialism do. And he even insinuated that leftists are the best at criticizing these attempts at socialism, which, I don't know, again, if I'm keeping it real, I have issues with that statement too. I don't know.
Authoritarian is only ever applied to successful socialist projects. The ones that failed were somehow more pure. But the moment a new system takes steps to ensure the security of their people and their new project, they're labeled authoritarian.
Yeah, so what he just described there is something that I hear from the left. It's that hey, yo, guys, we gotta restrict your freedom of speech. We can't allow freedom of assembly. We have to do these things to protect our fledgling attempt at socialism. I don't know. I don't really buy that. I don't really like that. I don't think these ideas, like I said, are so weak, so fragile that you need to ban thought, ban books, ban dissent in order to establish a better system. It's not true, in my opinion, that you need to do these things. And two, it's a slippery slope. We cede all of our power. We give you all of our ability to dissent and just hope you're going to do the right thing. And if you're not, we have absolutely zero ability to push back. That's just not a good thing, in my opinion. Maybe he would argue there is some structure available to push back, but again, it's not something that I can see in terms of what I've seen from these countries. I don't know.
I think part of this is that there's a lack of understanding among Western self-professed leftists regarding what it actually takes to change the status quo across an entire country. Every revolution, including bourgeois revolutions like the American one, are authoritarian by default. Those in power will never give up their power without a struggle. They're not going to let you vote out the very system that benefits them.
I mean, I don't know. I guess this has come up plenty of times. That last sentiment I do disagree with. You educate your population enough, you create an army of critical thinkers, they will come up to the correct conclusion. The truth will bubble to the top. We could have elected Bernie Sanders. We could, if we wanted to, elect a socialist or a government, a Senate, a House of Representatives, a president full of socialists. We could do these things if those ideas were popular and represented in the greater population. They will push back, of course. No, I think you can vote in socialism. I think that it is indeed possible. And saying that it's not makes your movement that much more inaccessible. I don't know.
To understand the nature of revolution a little better, let's go back to the man himself. No, the other one. His sugar daddy. There we go. Friedrich Engels. This large beard wrote a brilliant little piece called On Authority. It's like a page long. None of you have any excuse not to read it. It's linked below. But here's the part that I think is most applicable to this video.
I know I've said I'd never read theory. I think I have read that one.
Have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. It is the act whereby one part of the population imposes its will upon the other part by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannon. Authoritarian means, if such there be at all. And if the victorious party does not want to have fought in vain, it must maintain this rule by means of the terror which its arms inspire in the reactionists. Would the Paris Commune have lasted a single day if it had not made use of this authority of the armed people against the bourgeois? Should we not, on the contrary, reproach it for not having used it freely enough? Therefore, either one of two things. Either the anti-authoritarians don't know what they're talking about, in which case they are creating nothing but confusion, or they do know, and in that case they are betraying the movement of the proletariat. In either case, they serve the reaction. While it might not feel good to be called out from beyond the grave, it's so important that we understand what Engels was talking about here, because it's still true today. If a mass of people decide they're done with the current oppressive system, rise up, build something new, and then fail to protect the gains they've made, their project will be destroyed. We've seen it many times throughout history. The reactionary elements in society won't go away, and people with wealth...
But they can be taught out of your society. I think education is the sponge that cleans this reactionary rot.
And power before the revolution will still have that wealth, and will have likely fled somewhere like the US where they can agitate for military or CIA intervention. This was the case in Chile in 1973, when the democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende failed to take preventative measures to ensure the vicious reactionary class and their US-based co-conspirators couldn't undermine them. Long story short, the Chilean right wing launched a US-backed and US-funded coup to overthrow the government, eliminate Allende, and install a fascist military dictatorship that plunged the country into recession and suffering for decades. In order to avoid this happening, a budding socialist project, or heck, any project, requires police, it requires the shutting down of reactionary outlets, the banning of certain kinds of speech. There's a reason Germany banned everything related to the Nazis, for example. It's because they wanted to keep that sentiment from spreading as much as possible. It requires an intelligence apparatus to listen for terrorist plots, which were all too common post-revolution. In East Germany, the reactionaries would routinely attempt to blow up civilian train lines. It requires prisons to keep these people off the streets. And historically speaking, the socialists have been much better at using prisons for rehabilitation rather than just packing human beings away to rot like we do in the US. These things may not be morally correct.
Yeah, I mean, he's bringing up a lot of good points, which is why I don't want to... And I always say, I do provide caveats when I say, like, the argument leftists make about, you know, needing to squash reactionary sentiment. There's a part of me that understands that to an extent, that does agree with that to an extent. But again, I don't think these concepts are mutually exclusive. I think either way, you're gonna need to convince most of your population that, you know, your ideas are correct. So I think there is a way to do this without the more totalitarian, authoritarian, lack of democracy, lack of civil liberties, lack of speech type elements, I guess is what I'm saying very broadly. I'm trying to articulate what I'm trying to say. Anyway.
Correct. But like it or not, they are necessary. And that's something that every system has agreed on. I would love nothing more than to see an alternative work. But it never has. Maybe one day I'll be proven wrong. That would be amazing. But to the people who believe it is possible, you need to ask yourself how it's going to happen. We've seen what the people in Tsarist Russia had to do. We've seen what the Cubans had to do. We've seen what the Vietnamese had to do. What the Chinese had to do. What the Americans had to do to separate from the British. Your anti-authoritarianism, while I genuinely believe it comes from a good place, is handing an easy victory to the capitalist regime. They want you to play by their rules. It's their game. You play by their rules, you lose. End of story. One final thing that's important to note is that this anti-authoritarian stance is very much a Western thing. And I think the reason for that is that we here in the Imperial Core are in a very privileged position. We can hold these naive beliefs because we don't have any skin in the game. We're not the ones under the boot. We're not the ones whose resources are being extracted, or whose homes are being bombed, or whose cities are being occupied by armed invaders in the name of freedom and democracy. We have the luxury of condemning others because we've never been on the receiving end. Think for just a moment what it would be like if your neighborhood was occupied by a foreign military force, doing unspeakable things to your friends and loved ones, taking your belongings, burning homes, torturing people in the name of national security. What means would you resort to in that situation? I can't answer that for you, but it's something to think about.
Yeah, and as I've said, I'm more in favor, of incremental, voting, etc. If those capabilities exist, the way he's describing it, those people have no ability to vote out of their problems. In that case, yeah, of course you need to have some sort of more violent revolution. But what's established after this violent revolution, I don't think needs to be this so repressive of civil liberties. I don't think that's necessary. And again, it's too much of a slippery slope. It's a question I've asked before, but when, if ever, is China going to allow people to speak freely or a free press? I don't know. It's given me a lot to think about, I will say, this last 5 or so minutes, but a lot to think about.
I know this has been kind of a heavy video, and for a lot of you, I'm sure this is the first time you've been asked to look at your home country more critically.
Again, I think I've graduated beyond that. I'm willing to, I already know a lot about this horrible, shitty stuff that we do in the US, in the West in general, of course. But I do think there are many valid, reasonable criticisms that you can aim at these attempts at socialism that, again, I'm going to be honest, I don't think that, certain people on the left are willing to do, I guess.
If you're interested in learning more about any of the stuff we've talked about, there are links in the description. We all have a responsibility to choose our words carefully, apply labels correctly, and hold our own nations to the same standard we expect others to meet. Maybe it's time we retire the word authoritarian and try to engage with the facts more precisely, more honestly, and in good faith.
Again, I wish he talked more about the whole restricting civil liberties, restricting freedom of speech. I feel like he did the softballs, surveillance, police, things like that. There were certain things, certain characterizations that I straight up just disagreed with the way he was putting it. I wish he talked a little bit more about the way and it's not just me. I think the way I described it is the problem a lot of people on the left have with these countries like China, the USSR, etc. There's a lot about those arguments that I empathize with or I sympathize with or whatever, but ultimately, I don't feel like my concerns and those concerns of a lot of people, other people on the left or whatever, have over these countries were properly addressed in this video. So yeah, it does feel like he kind of touched on the softballs, not really addressing what, in my opinion, at least people on the left really worry about or focus on when they talk about these countries. I think taking Wikipedia at face value for the number of police killings in China is very disingenuous, especially considering the events in Hong Kong. It's an interesting thing to bring up. It's very likely that in the event of another Tiananmen Square incident, this information would be obscured in some way. Yeah, I mean, it is common knowledge that the information coming out of China is very sanitized. I think this video is great so far, but this seems to be a weak point in your reporting. Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of issues with the way he was characterizing in this video. Like, by far, like, not even close, the most issues that I've ever had with the Second Thought video. How can we as socialists be sure that the numbers China has given are correct? For me, it is still difficult to believe. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at too. My favorite part of this was when he inadvertently defended the purges while trying very carefully not to discuss them. Tanky is not a derogatory word for communists. Tanky is a derogatory word for a right-wing fascist pretending to be a communist using left-wing aesthetics as cover. This word originates from leftists, and right-wing opposition rarely, if ever, uses it. I don't think Wikipedia page for police killings in China is the best source. It says right at the top that it's incomplete. China's police killings data is not available. The Wikipedia page you quoted is just a list of the police killings the author of the article was able to track down. If you look at the world data for police killings, China and Russia are grayed out because we don't have data for those countries. Yeah. I've always thought of authoritarianism as being when a party or leader in charge will not let the people vote and or will use force to stamp down any and all political opposition, and that does encompass so many so-called democracies. Yeah, I mean, this is finally I found someone trying to talk about kind of what I was talking about, and again, I think this is how a lot of people who use this term will criticize these attempts at socialism, these socialist countries or whatever. And he did not really address this. In some places, he hand-waved it. And in some places, he gave what I would call almost factually incorrect information, like saying Chinese citizens have more democratic power than American citizens. Like, I just don't believe that's true. Even if I accept that at first a revolution would necessitate authoritarian means to survive, establish socialism, and defend itself from reactionaries, how long would it stay in power? Yeah, that's a question I have. Did I leave this comment? Is this my alt account? Because what history seems to tell me that the answer to this is indefinitely. Yeah. And I'm not sure I like that. I'm with you. Yeah, like, this comment, again, it's hitting the nail on the nose, or whatever the expression is. Then again, is it much different to the false choice between capitalism and slightly less capitalism that modern? This is a good point too. I'm not trying to say what we're doing here in the West and the U.S. is great, or by any means. But there's a lot of questions here that I have, that this guy also seems to have, that I don't think were properly addressed in this video, that other people I've seen have, that I don't think were properly addressed in this video.